following sermon was delivered at the 10:30 worship service at the United Methodist Church of Kent. Please enjoy.
One of the great gifts our scriptures give to us is their plain honesty about what it means to be human. The good, the bad, the in-between, it's all there in our scriptures, whether we are ready to face it or not. For example, the universality of human suffering and human pain. Those aren't realities that we like to face. Massive industries, in fact, are devoted to helping us try to avoid them. Everything from painkillers to anti-aging gimmicks to various forms of entertainment. We deploy this varied and vast arsenal to try to distract ourselves from facing the reality that we are mortal, that we are limited, that we all sometimes hurt and suffer. But our scriptures and our faith tradition, for their part, they refuse to participate in that deception. They refuse to turn away or to pretend. Instead, they insist on telling us the truth and so repeatedly give voice to our real experiences of hardship and pain and frustration and disappointment and suffering and deep uncertainty. Even to our doubts about God's very presence, those moments, those seasons of life, those circumstances when our sense of God's presence is strained and God seems to us, if not altogether absent, then somehow hidden and far away. Both of our readings on this third Sunday in Lent speak this truth to us about our human condition. The first of our readings from Isaiah is this broad and generous invitation, all who are thirsty, come to the water. But that invitation, we recall, is offered very specifically to a community who is suffering, a community who is suffering greatly. They are living as exiles, living as refugees, having been deported out of their homeland to Babylon. That's the thirst referenced here. Their deep longing for their suffering finally to end, to be able to return back home. And then in our gospel, we find two more groups who are suffering, along with tough questions about the meaning of that suffering. One of them is intentional, Galileans killed by Rome while they're worshiping, offering their religious sacrifices. The other is accidental, 18 people who just happened to be crushed by a tower that fell on them. Each instance reminds us of human suffering, whether intentional or accidental, this terribly common, unavoidable part of being human. We all suffer. We all feel pain. We all bump into the constraints of being mortal. Despite our many attempts to pretend that it were otherwise, we know these truths, of course, in our bones. From local to national to global tragedies, we see the images, hear the stories, and we've felt pain and suffering more personally as well, in our own bodies, in our own minds, in our own spirits. Aging bodies and minds, neighbors causing harm, expectations for the future frustrated. And though these experiences of pain and suffering are common, one of the terrible consequences of them is how they can make us feel isolated, separate, and alone. In our seasons of acute suffering, it can feel as though the whole world has shrunk down to the parameters of ourselves. Our perception narrows, and it's difficult to consider the long history of human suffering, or to perceive that our suffering somehow might be in community with those who have suffered before. The whole expanse collapses in on us, and the similar experiences of others, even those very well-meaning sentiments of, I know just how you feel, they're only vaguely comforting when our own hearts are breaking, when our own bodies or minds are letting us down. In such challenging seasons, filled with many more questions than answers, it can feel as though we are the only ones who have ever gone through that kind of pain, that sort of suffering, that particular type of trauma or grief. Pain and suffering are both universal, but also intensely personal, which is why it's not all that helpful to compare our pain to others. Pain is pain. It hurts. And when it's hurting us, it can be all-consuming. It can feel like a very lonely journey. And at various points along that journey, we are likely to ask some pretty essential questions, many of those questions beginning with why. like, why me? And why is this happening now? And why is this hard thing a part of my story? And while those questions of why rarely have satisfying answers, still they are important for us to ask. For why questions express our search for meaning in and through that pain. They reveal our limits and our longing. They give voice to our frustration and our fear. Why is a fundamental question and a sacred question too. It's a question that walks us in the direction of Good Friday, where Jesus' question from the cross echoes that same thing, echoing an earlier prayer, Psalm 22. Why, Jesus asks while hanging on the cross, my God, why? Why have you left me all alone? In her 2009 book, An Altar in the World, author and priest Barbara Brown Taylor writes that pain makes theologians of us all, opening us to grow and inviting us to learn about being human. Taylor illustrates that claim with a story about one of her own experiences after injuring her eye while pruning trees, the sorts of questions that she asked during the long night of intense pain that followed. Every time I woke up, the pain shot through me like a shock, she writes, and every time it did, I cried out loud. I took more aspirin and fell asleep again. I woke up and got shocked again. My right eye, she says, felt as if there were still a large chunk of bark in it, so I felt my way downstairs and lay down in the bathtub, letting warm water run straight into my eye. The pain, she says, got worse, not better. While the clock tolled hour after hour, I prayed the kinds of prayers I never thought I would pray. I began the kind of bargaining with God that I don't even believe in. And when that didn't work, I called God's honor into question. I begged God to do something. I dared God to do something, each of these so resonant with our Psalms. Finally, she says, close to dawn, I found myself turning away from the God in charge of pain removal toward the God who had stayed with me through the pain, no matter what I said. Let me say that again. Close to dawn, I found myself turning away from the God in charge of pain removal toward the God who had stayed with me through the pain, no matter what I said. The pain, she writes, had not only changed the way I prayed, but had also changed my ideas about the one to whom I prayed. In and through our experiences of pain, or grief, or disappointment, or despair, or frustration, or suffering, we can learn more about living in these bodies. Growing, for example, to focus less on having a long life or pain-free life, and more on living a full life instead. By awakening more truthfully to our limitations, we can deepen our understanding of ourselves and our relationship with the living, loving God. We each experience pain, whether just for a moment or for a whole lifetime. And that isn't our fault, Jesus reminds us today, refusing to add blame on top of the pain. But he does ask us to consider what we'll do with it, how we can grow from it, and what we can learn. For we may not control many of our life's circumstances, but we can control our response. By grace, we can turn even the most difficult challenges into opportunities to deepen and to grow, to open our hearts and our lives to the presence of God's grace and love. Though it may feel like our pain or suffering isolate us, more truly, we are never alone. Jesus' own experiences of senseless suffering remind us of that. Christ is with us in our suffering. God accompanies us in all our pain. Today's first reading, again, is this generous invitation to listen, to come alive, to remember God's promises and eat what is good, to notice and to be nourished by God's accompaniment, specifically in exile, in a foreign land, when deported, in a place when we're feeling all alone. Over and again throughout our scriptures we find this. When folks are suffering or in trouble, when they're held captive in Egypt, when they're wandering through the wilderness, when they're exiled in Babylon, when they're under threat or occupation, when they are being betrayed by friends, when they are experiencing sickness and disease, when they're just struggling to be human or to be church. Over and over in our scriptures, again and again and again, God keeps showing up, keeps noticing our pain, keeps seeing our suffering, keeps knowing our grief, keeps witnessing our oppression. And God says again and again in a staggering variety of ways, desperately longing for us finally to hear and to trust, here I am, right here, in it, with you. And however bad it gets, I am never going away. For God's gracious solidarity means that God notices us and comes to us, delivers us and heals us, even becomes human to suffer and die with us. For God will not and God cannot ever abandon what God has made. And I do realize, of course, that being told all of that really doesn't make much of a difference for us. If you are hurting right now, if you are in pain right now, if you are suffering in your body or your mind or your relationships or on behalf of another, it really doesn't matter being told that God is with you and for you. We can't just be told this and trust it. We must experience this reality in our own bodies and minds and selves. Thanks be to God, by grace, I know that I have, and I hope that you have too. In my own moments of pain, in my own journeys through grief, in my own experiences bumping hard into the limits of my body, God's presence isn't always as obvious as Isaiah's invitation or as tangible as Jesus' body, but still it's there, still it's here, still it's everywhere, always trying to get our attention. Little nudges, maybe softer than the gentlest hand on our shoulder, or little voices, maybe quieter than a whisper, but still there, still here, experiences of hope and strength and solidarity. I wonder when you have felt them or noticed them in your life, in your seasons of need, those messages and experiences and promises from God that you cling to when you're suffering or in pain. Maybe moments when you have heard God's voice speaking through a friend who offered just the right word at just the right time, a word of encouragement or accountability, or maybe silence, just holding space for your expressions. Or moments when you have felt God's presence through the presence of someone who made some effort to come and be with you, to accompany you, to join you in some challenging time. Or moments when you have noticed God's hands at work in the world around you, the beauty of a sunrise, the suddenness of a spring wildflower, the bodies of a community coming together to build a more loving world. I wonder when you have been awakened to those thin moments of our lives, when God's presence becomes strangely palpable, and God's presence is really here. All who are thirsty, come to the water. Whoever has no money, whoever has no energy, whoever has no clear direction forward, whoever has no hope, whoever has nothing left to give, come buy food and eat. Without money, at no cost, come and be renewed. For our God walks with us through the deepest valleys. Our God stays with us on the loneliest nights. Though we will all suffer and feel pain, yet God remains our constant companion. God will never leave us. God will never abandon us, even in death and even in life. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the United Methodist Church of Kent Sermon Podcast. For more information about the church, visit www.kentmethodist.org.